Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure being at your beautiful meeting in this nice little town. And I have to tell you that I especially enjoy speaking to people in Europe that worry about cognitive robotics, because you guys have a philosophical predisposition, and it feels good speaking to you. So today, you heard from the psychologists, you heard from Srini yesterday, and we heard from Peter Domini about action, language, behavior. This talk is the last one. So it will move in similar dimensions. So to begin with, what I would like to do is show you, well, first let me introduce the team very quickly. This is Cornelia Vermeulen, who is our star, and she's the creative force behind many of the projects. And the people to my right are Chin Lik Teo and Yetsu Yang, and their work will be mentioned several times today. And the work is supported by a number of organizations, and the bulk of the funding comes from the European Union and a project that is called Poeticon, that you see there. And it is a consortium with the IIT in Italy, IST in Lisbon, and CSRI, the Cognitive Science Research Institute in Athens, and the University of Plymouth. Now, before I start, I would like to show you two videos. One video is about going from action to language. What you see here is 4 different videos of the same activity with different processing going on. And I have to apologize for the slight misalignment in time. So what is happening is the computer is looking at the action that this person is doing, and there is a number of operations that are taking place. And what you see at the bottom is a description of what is taking place, produced automatically by the system in English. Okay, the video will go on for about 10 minutes or so, but what I wanted to bring to your attention is that this is one of the problems that we are going to be dealing with. We are looking at human beings doing things with their hands, with tools and objects, and we would like to produce language describing this. So this is going from action to language. And here we go from language to action, where we're going to ask a robot, stir the coffee. Stir the coffee. How are you going to stir the coffee? So now starts the thinking. Now the robot is going to look into its knowledge databases and its reasoning processes in order to find out how is it going to stir and what is the thing that is going to stir. So it's looking to resolve this variable that denotes the tool of the steering action. The robot knows that the steering action requires something to steer with. So it's looking at this lexical resource that we have named the Praxicon, and it is trying to identify something to steer with that is available on the table. And it found the spoon. So now it's looking for the coffee. What does it mean, stir the coffee? The coffee has to be somewhere. There is no coffee beans or coffee anywhere, but there is a cup. So it's going into the coffee neighborhood, and it is trying to find various alternatives on the basis of its knowledge. And finally, it found the cup, and it's going to now make a plan because it knows that it has to reach for the spoon, and then it has to put the spoon in the cup, and it has to stir. So this is an example of going from language to action. Now, both these cases, where you go from action to language or from language to action, we want to have the same underlying models that deal with them. Okay. So we'll see that video later. So this is our problem. We have a robot that is looking at humans doing actions, and we would like to figure out what these actions are, and would like to learn to get the robot to do similar actions. Now, we're talking about actions, language, behavior. People have been thinking about these questions for the past 100 years and longer. They didn't call it like that. But if you look at the literature in perception of action, language, behavior, then you identify 4 basic problems. One is the degrees of freedom problem that has been studied heavily by Bernstein, the Russian guy. Basically, there are many ways to do an action, yet you pick out one. How do you do that? The second problem is the perception-action integration problem. In other words, you do an action, you have to know what are the results of your action. If you don't understand that, you are in big trouble. The next one, which is the one that I'm most interested in this year, is the action sequencing problem. Actions consist of sub-actions, and sub-actions of other actions. And all of these sub-actions are put together in interesting ways to perform complex tasks, like making a sandwich. And the final problem is the problem of learning. How do you learn those actions? By observing them and taking all the available sensory information, like sound as well, if it is possible, and also prior knowledge. So these are the 4 major areas in which we are going to be moving. Okay, actions contain objects, tools, hands, and movements. So in order to make our job easier in the form of performing the experiments, we'd like to do experiments on a table. So we will restrict ourselves in manipulatory actions, actions that humans do with their hands, and tools and objects. In other words, I will take out the locomotive tasks, because you can walk around and do things, etc., change location. We're not going to do that because it makes the experiments much harder. Not in this talk. So here's the plan of this presentation. It's basically what Srini was talking about, the middle level. And most of that stuff is in the middle level. So the first thing we'll talk about is attention. Finding and recognizing objects. And the way we're going to do this is using contours, because the current literature is full on pattern recognition approaches where you can learn an object from examples and build classifiers and so on and so forth. The second thing we're going to focus on is recognizing goals, the consequences of actions. For example, if you have a knife and you cut a tomato, you know that you cut a tomato because now you have 2 pieces. And you have to be able to detect that. This is action consequences. And finally, we will talk about parsing action sequences using the manipulation grammar. But in doing that parsing, we are going to need the previous processes. So I try to make this as self-contained as possible, so that at the end of the talk, you will have a pretty good idea how these 2 first videos are working, what is underlying the processes there. Okay? Now, attention. You probably have heard about attention a great deal. people have been working on saliency measures and approaches where you apply it to an image and it gives you the important things. Okay, so here is an example. So that particular attention mechanism looks at the stop sign as being the important thing. Who knows why? Perhaps it's different from the surroundings. Okay, so this is where that field is. However, this is not very useful for us. Why? Because we want to find objects. We want to find the knife. We want to find your gun. You want to find your scissors. You want to find your tool. You want to find your tomato. You are looking for something. So this is a motivating example. Your kitchen after a party and you're looking for your scissors. That's the real problem. Now, if you apply those bottom-up saliency mechanisms, you will get nothing in here. You have to do something where you have to bring prior information into the signal processing. Okay? And that's what we will do. Because of the constraints on time, I cannot spend a lot of time on it, so I will go directly into the definition. We have introduced, and this is mostly work of Cornelia Vermeulen, we have introduced a new signal processing operator, which is called the torque. The torque for images. Now, you know the torque in physics. It is a very similar definition. What is the torque? Let's say you have an image, and I guess this is a pointer. Yeah, you have an image here, and you consider an edge, here E, this vector, and you have a point. You have the vector from point O to the edge, this vector R. So the torque at this point O is the cross product of this vector R with this vector E, the cross product of R and E, which is a vector T. It's vertical on this plane, perpendicular. That's what the torque is at a point because of an edge. Now, if you consider all the edges inside here, you can add up the torques, and you can find the total torque at that point. Okay? You can find the total torque in a patch. And the value of the torque is indicative of unclosedness. If you have a point and the torque is very high, that means that point is unclosed by lines, and it is most probably inside an object. Okay? So some properties of the torque, as you can see here, but let's do an example. Let's say you have this image. These are the edges you would get. So what we're going to do is we're going to compute the torque at multiple window sizes. So we're going to go to a point here, take a small window, size 5 by 5, and go to every pixel in the image, put that window around that pixel so that pixel is at the center, and compute the torque for that pixel inside the window by finding all the edges and summing up the torques. And you do it for every pixel, and that's what you get. Now, if you keep increasing the size, this is for a 21 by 21 size, you get that. And finally, if you put them together in scale space, you get something like this. And you can see here, this is like a proto-segmentation kind of output. It's not real segmentation because the objects are not standing out completely. However, they give you places where the interesting things happen. Okay? So, for example, using that torque, you can clean up the edges. Using that torque mechanism, you can clean up the edges to get them to this state, okay, which are more indicative of the objects that are there. So what we would like to do is use this mechanism in order to find objects and recognize them. And what I would like to bring to you here, to your attention, is that the problems we need to deal with is problems of clutter. because we are going to be working with objects, some of which are occluded. We don't see them fully. Or the hands are picking up something. You don't see it. It's covered by the hand. So occlusion is very important constraint. In other words, we're not going to have the object all the time fully visible. Okay. So basically, from these images here, you see these two images are the same, and we want to concentrate on two different objects, the flashlight and the cap that you have here. And what you see here is the torque map, an uninformed torque map of this. Torque map, the same thing. But what you see here is the torque map modulated by the model of the flashlight. In other words, as you make the torque map, the edges that you consider in order to compute the torque, you are matching them with lines and contours that you have in the models of objects that you have in your memory. And if they do, you increase the value of the torque. Okay, so for example, here it gives you possible places in the scene where your object could be. And that's the beginning. Because now we'll go to that place and we'll scrutinize it. And we will segment the object out. Okay? So here are some examples. First, you determine fixations. Then you match contours at fixations, those models that you have. And then finally, you do target detection. The contours you can learn from databases. We have done that. Or you can enter them in some other kind of way from annotated examples. And what I would like to draw your attention to is what is the big deal, okay? The big deal is the following. Because you have the torque, you have a point inside the object. You have a point inside the object. That's the maximum of the torque. So basically, as you are looking at the contours of this object, and you try to match, you are not going to have a situation like this or like that. You know that this is the inside of your object. So the way you are going to do the matching is going to matter when you utilize, for example, shape context algorithms. Okay? So, and here is something that is well known, where you basically achieve, through fast Fourier transform, some rotational invariance. People know about that, but we have to use this as well. So the point that I'm trying to make is that even if in this situation here, I don't even know if this is what, okay, the hands are holding this. So basically, these contours here are not all visible, okay? So basically, if you do shape context only without considering the torque, you are going to miss it, because those guys here will give you wrong results. However, if you do torque shape context, then you can match this thing to that thing, this thing to that thing, this thing to that thing, and you can be almost certain that this is a bottle. Okay? Good. Here are some more results from the experiments. On the left, you see the contour world. Here is the object. Here is the position where it is. Here is its recognition. And this is happening with all the different objects. And here you can see them in videos, under occlusion, and so on and so forth. You see the red fixation. It always found that object. Okay. Now I have to move to something that is necessary for pedagogical purposes, so that you can understand what I will tell you afterwards. Okay? Let me make a parenthesis here. Understanding is a recursive process. You understand something because you relate it to something else that you already understand. How do you understand that something else? Well, because you relate it to something else that you already understand. And how about that something else? Well, because you relate it to something else that you already understand. You have to stop. Somewhere you have to stop. This is very relevant for what we are going to be discussing today. I think where you stop is your body, because this is what you know intimately. I mean, you know other things too, but you don't want anybody to tell you that this is your hand. You know that. So I would like to discuss a little bit the problem of segmentation, because we will use it in our process. So how do you do segmentation? If you pick up a book on computer vision and you say segmentation, they think, the literature thinks that segmentation is this process where you break up the image into homogeneous regions that seem to have the same kind of property. So you get things like that. Okay, you must have seen them in books. And those algorithms, all of them, in order to work, you have to tell them how many regions they should be expecting. So if you say 10 regions, you get this. If you say 60 regions, you get this with this famous algorithm. So here you lose the horse. Here you lose the trees. However, this has nothing to do with the reality of biological systems. Because when you look at the scene, you don't segment everything. It's not possible. At least you segment what you're looking at. And if you look at the horse, you segment the horse. If you look at the tree, you segment the tree. You see, in both cases, the result is not perfect. However, this is what you're doing. You segment what you are looking at. Not everything. That's what we would like to do. What are we looking at? The torque is going to tell us where to look. Has already told us. So we go there, we look there, and now we want to segment. So basically, let's say this is your image. And here you have a change of color. It's not an important contour. But here is the boundary, important contour. So here is your fixation point. Now, what you want is you want to find the object that contains this. Is it this, or is it the big one? You want the big one, where the important contour is. However, optimizations that you will do will fall into a trap, because this is a shorter contour. They will pick this one instead of the big one, and that would be a mistake. So we have to normalize for the length, and the way to do that is to use the log polar space that has been very much in fashion 20 years ago, but I think it will come back, because everything comes back after 20 years. So very quickly, the log polar map is you have an image, you take these sectors, and you make them rows. The first sector is the first row. The second sector, the second row, and so on. And from this image, you get this image. Then you can go back, of course. But the log polar map is very interesting because, as you see here, if you have cyclotorsion, if you have rotation of the plane, it becomes a shift in the horizontal direction in the log polar space. That's a well-known result. But that makes signal processing easy, because the whole image here is moving with the same shift. And if you have scaling, as you have here in this case, then it becomes shift in the vertical dimension. Okay, so basically this is, let's say, our image, and these are our edges that we will get, and this is edges that we will reinforce from depth and motion. And that's how we start. And now you put your fixation point here, and you want to find the object that surrounds this. So you go to log polar space, and that means now you have to find a contour from the top line, which is the 0 degrees, to this line, which is 360. And this is the boundary of the object. The object is on the left, the background is on the right. As long as you are able to bring that line down, you have solved the segmentation problem, just for one object only, the one you're looking at. And here we are putting it back into the original scene. That's the algorithm. That's the algorithm. Again, you do this conversion, and then how do you bring the line? There are many ways to do the optimization. The one that has been used here is a graph cut algorithm, where you have this graph. Graph is the image. You know that this belongs to the object. You know that this belongs to the background. And now you have to bring a line down to cut this graph so that the green pixels here will be your object and the red pixels will be your background. Okay? So that's an easy problem to solve. People know how to solve this. And you find the optimal cut. Good. So now, let us see what happens when you cut a cucumber. What happened here? Let's play it again. You are segmenting the object, but then you are also monitoring it. You are monitoring what happens to the object. So in other words, we are doing both tracking and segmentation at the same time, so that we can understand what is happening to the object. Now, you may think that there's a million things that can happen to an object. That is not true. Well, it could be true at some level, but at the top level, we could only find these 6 different things that could happen to objects. What can happen to an object? You can have an assemble, where you have 2 objects coming together. Or you can have a divide, where you break or cut an object into 2 pieces, at least. You can have a consume, where you eat it or you make it disappear. And you can have a create, where all of a sudden it comes out. You can have transfer, and you can have deform. Anything else is below that. And if you know of any basic thing that you can do to an object that we have missed, you should tell me. So basically what we would like to do in order to develop a mechanism is to be able to recognize those things. Now you may say there is many ways to do assemble, because you can put something on top of another, you can take a screw and put it on a hole and start screwing. There's many ways to assemble things. That is true. However, they are all assembled. You put 2 things together. And there are many ways to break apart a thing. You can cut it with a knife, you can cut it with a saw, you can break it with your hands, depending on the object, of course. But then you are creating more pieces from what you had before. Okay? So basically, this is the algorithm. The algorithm is like the segmentation algorithm, but instead of 1 fixation point, now we put many. We put many fixation points. And for each fixation point, we do a segmentation. And after we do a segmentation, we move those fixation points like random particles. They make in random motion. And we do this again and again, and we merge the different segmentations. So that's what the algorithm is. It's straightforward, actually. Here's an example of assemble from a database. Easy. That was an easy example. And you see the graph on the left that shows the structure of that graph. Here is you cut this piece of paper. You had 1, now you have 2. The most difficult are the liquids. And I was very happy to hear about liquids today from our psychology colleagues. But really, the liquids are very hard. Here is one example of a transfer where basically we put black coffee into this white pitcher. Otherwise, it would have been impossible. And the solution is, we are missing some of the coffee, but we detected the transfer from the one thing to the other. Or here you can have, moving while you respect occlusions. This is transforming the location. Okay. So now we are ready to move into the manipulation grammar, using the tools that we have developed up to now, so that we can parse manipulatory sequences. Okay? And I'll show you this slide, which is an overall view of what is happening here. You are looking at someone doing a manipulation action. Here he's cutting, I don't know, an eggplant, I think. This is the grammar. Now, using what I described in the grammar, you can build those trees. Those trees are describing to you the evolution of the action. So you see the first one says, left hand, grasp, knife. And you put, the parser puts this dummy node. Otherwise, if it doesn't put this dummy nodes, you get a forest. So by putting the dummy node, you get trees every time at every step. So the first step was, in that action, the guy grasped the knife with the left hand. Then he grasped the eggplant with the right hand. Then he cut. He cut here. Here's the cut. Then he finished cutting. If you finish cutting, you have to take this out. And you're back here. Then he put down the knife, and he is back at this situation. Okay? So now, imagine that you have a robot, and you have those trees, and you have this grammar. Then, from the trees and the grammar, you can make these triplets. Left hand grasp knife, right hand grasp eggplant, knife cut. The robot knows how to do this. If you tell a robot left hand grasp, he knows how to do that. And he knows how to do this, and he knows how to do that. So we have basically translated this now to a language that a robot can understand, like any robot. So basically, by using the same mechanism, we can interpret this, and we can do the same thing by following those triplets. Okay? Now let's look at a more detailed example of making a sandwich. This is going to be very simple, and the goal of this visual depiction is to explain the concepts behind. So here, he's speaking, that's the action. You take the cheese and you put it on the bread. Now you see the hand tracking. We can track the hands and the objects as they move with the hands. So we know where the object is moving with the hand. Here is recognition, where you are recognizing the particular objects that you have. And now you have to put them all together in the building of this tree that is describing the activity. Assemble. The activity is assemble. You put it there. Now assemble is finished. Finished. We have to take it out. And this grasp is finished, and the other grasp is finished, and we are here. And that's the end. Okay. Now, I'll show you more examples. But before we dig into language, I would like you to take a little bit of an imaginary step back in time and think of your ancestors, like more than 500,000 years ago. Those ancestors, they didn't talk. However, would you say that they understood what was going on around them? What would you think? Yeah, they understood pretty well. Not everything, and they couldn't say everything, things that involve plans and future, but they knew the here and now. They knew that this guy is taking my woman, and he's going to make children with her. So he would take a stick and go after him. So they knew extremely well what was going on. How? What is it that they knew? They were observing others doing things. So they had an understanding of action. How? This is a piece of the puzzle, not the whole thing, what I'm about to describe to you. They had a grammar for this. And in my opinion, it is that grammar that gave rise to the grammar of language. Because it was first. It was first there. So anyway, if you study the literature in linguistics, I'm not a linguist myself, but I have been reading a lot about linguistics, like many of you. You will come to the work of Chomsky, who suggested that he said, look, it looks like all the languages of the world are the same. They seem to be produced by the same mechanism. And he called that the universal grammar. A far-reaching idea. Many linguists don't agree with it. This is a version of the universal grammar that was developed by one of his students called Ray Jackendorf, who is a famous linguist. And it is called the X-bar schema. Strange name, but that's what it is. The X-bar schema, they called it, because they had X and X with a bar on top, so X-bar. And what this schema says is that every word follows this. In other words, if X is a noun, then the structure of the noun in the sentence will be described by this. If this is a verb, again the same, and so on. Okay, so basically, if you have a sentence that says, he studies mathematics, linguistics at the university, then you can use this X-bar theory to do a parsing of this and get syntax and eventually meaning out of that. However, another thing you can do is you can play a little game where instead of X, you consider action, okay? And instead of XP, consider a hand phrase, something that the hand can do. And then the rest follows. And so if you do that to get the intuition, you end up with a grammar that has 4 rules, which we are about to describe. Okay, so H is the hand, A stands for actions, verbs, and O, objects. AP will be for action phrase, and HP will be for hand phrase. So an action phrase, an action can be applied to an object. An action can be applied to an object directly. Or to a hand phrase. An action can be applied to a hand phrase, which in turn contains an object. The object is inside here. So either you do it directly, or you do it to a hand phrase that has inside the object. And the other 2 rules, you have an action phrase, you can combine it directly with a hand, or a hand phrase, which recursively builds up the hand phrase. So we start with those rules. How are we going to parse now with those rules? Every time there's a new triplet coming in, you have 2 kinds of actions. You have what we call constructive actions and destructive actions. What is a constructive action? A constructive action is when you grasp something. A destructive action is when you ungrasp it, you leave it. Okay? Or a constructive action is when you start cutting. And now you finish cutting. That's a destructive action. We need to have these 2 so that we can appropriately change the trees when the triple comes, or the action is finished. So basically, when the triplet comes, then you can incorporate it into the existing tree as such. And when the action is finished, then you have to erase the nodes that are relevant, that have been introduced by this action. Because the tree you get, it has to reflect what's happening now. Now! At this point in time, it shows a temporal evolution of the action. So, this is an important thing that we need to understand, capture here. So here is the scene for making the sandwich. And what you see here is various functions that denote the distance between the left hand and object, and the distance between right hand and object is blue and red. And then you have left hand speed and right hand speed, and object 1 speed and object 2 speed, these curves. Now, these are signals, functions. And then these are events. This is left or right hand grasp, L and R. This is left and right hand ungrasp. This is assemble and finish assemble. These are events. And those events you can recognize inside the signals. They are happening here, they are happening there, they are happening there, they are happening here. Because you see, the hand is moving and the object is moving with it. That's an event. Contact. People talked about this, contact. I go one little step further. No contact, no action. There is no action for which there is no contact, at least human action. If you are to do something, you have to come into contact with something. Whether you press a button, or you pick up something, or whatever it is, there has to be contact. So that contact is recognized. And some of these contacts are recognized here in the signals. So you have events that happen in multisensory spaces. And how do you know about those events? You know because they have some simultaneity. They have some correlation. In this particular case, you saw the movement of the hand and the object or the tool and so on. So here's the example. Left hand grasp bread, left hand grasp, right hand grasp cheese, then assemble the bread and the cheese. Then you are finished assembling, you have to erase this and that, and you are left with those two trees with a dummy up here, and then you put down, you don't hold anything anymore, and you are down to this situation. Here we're going to cut an eggplant to make Greek moussaka. So cut the eggplant. So Getsu is the eggplant cutter. Left hand, grasp eggplant. Right hand, grasp knife. Now he's moving the knife. Now we are analyzing what kind of movement that is. Looks like a cutting movement. But is it really? Well, now he's going to get rid of the cut because he finished. But he's going to check the consequence. Checking the consequence, yes, it's a cut. So we are sure. Put down the knife, leave the eggplant, grasp will become an ungrasp, and the other thing will become an ungrasp, and we're down here. As you see, we're not that sophisticated yet, because that should show that the original object now is two objects, okay? We haven't incorporated that into the parser yet. It's our next step. Here we're going to draw a line on Planck. What we wanted to do is actually use this concept for smart manufacturing. Now everybody is interested in smart manufacturing. So one idea is to have people, to have the system looking at people while they do assembly operations and find whether they make any mistakes. And say, boom, mistake, or, you know, the human-computer interaction can be very different. So anyway, that's a project for the future. So here is Getsu. You see, we have tried to simplify. Actually, this experiment happened in Telluride, Colorado, where Yulia is going to go next summer to participate in a project. It's a neuromorphic cognition engineering workshop where people go for 3 weeks, and they work day and night for 3 weeks, and some of them do amazing things. So anyway, here he continues. Where are we? He is going to draw. Draw. The trees can get very, very, very large, as you can see. Draw. Finished. Done. Put it down. So the confluence of the recognition procedures with the tracking and segmentation procedures, together with the detection of those events I was talking about, and the grammar, is producing this. All right? So what is next? What is next is, how do you do the learning? How are you going to get now the robot to learn? Okay? Because it has to learn those trees. So one possibility is that you can observe. Another possibility is you can have raw language resources. A recipe. You read a recipe, and you turn the recipe into those trees. And then those trees with the grammar, you turn it into the triplets for the robot to perform the action. Or you can go to Wikipedia and get some text if you know how to process text. Or from human instructions, like you teach your child. You say, hey, first you do this, and then you do that, and then you are done. Same thing. You could do the same thing because the problem has been formulated that way. And of course, human-robot interaction and collaboration can capitalize on this clearly. And you can do action prediction, and you can warn for mistakes, and all that stuff that is very useful. Now, something that I didn't tell you. I told you about the what of the action, but I didn't tell you about the how. In other words, how is the control going to be? What kind of movement is going to be applied? How am I going to do the cutting movement? Now, the reason I haven't told you is because I don't have an optimal answer yet. And perhaps, you know, people like Gregor and people like Martin, people who think about dynamical systems are better equipped to answer this question. Why? Because imagine, you have all these representations in your mind about actions that you do with tools. You know them. So what is it that you know? When you say cut, what is it that you know? Do you remember a particular movement or not? So according to this theory that I am describing here, the movement is part of the story, the movement. And in the interpretation job, I can do it, because I can find out whether somebody is cutting with a knife by looking at the movement. Because after all, I don't have thousands of actions here that the guy is doing, okay? But I do not have a generative model of the acceleration, the force. Why? Because what is an action? An action is the transfer of force or torque from your hands and tool to an object. And that can be studied systematically. We are currently trying to learn acceleration profiles, but I'm not even sure that this is the right question. You know, I have to tell you, when it comes to action, perception, language, cognition, you can work for 20 years for nothing. Because if you ask the wrong question, you haven't done anything. You can waste your life. To tell you the truth, I'm very paranoid about this. Every question that I ask and anything that my students do, I have to every day ask, is this the right thing to do? Is this the right thing to do? You should be asking this question because it's a very slippery slope, the slope of the action. So here I can show you the videos that I started with, if we have any time. So this is, again, the experiment that happened in Telluride. I don't see it playing. Okay. Where we got various saws and tools and scissors and wanted to engage, in tasks that have to do with arts and crafts or with assembling small machines and so on. So basically what you are seeing here is 4 different views. We also track the body. I wasn't absolutely necessary. We track the objects, recognize the objects, the tools, recognize. We also track the hands. And for that we use an amazing piece of software that was developed by the Greeks in Crete, in the Institute Forth. That is the best software for tracking hands. And we have made some modifications to it. And we are tracking the hands, and we're also recognizing at the same time the posture of the hands, so that we can understand, you know, there are about 32 different ways of grasping. We can recognize 4 out of the 32 with this system up to now. And the grasps, if you understand what kind of grasp it is, it's very useful because it can help you also in the classification of the object. So here he's sewing. So Planck moves saw away from Planck, and so on. I think you got the idea. Basically, the story of action is a story of signals and symbols that are coordinated. The symbols are following rules, the manipulation grammar. The signals are subject, are inputs to the processes of attention, segmentation, tracking, recognition, and access to memory. You do them together at the same time, and you parse the sequences in a way similar, not equivalent, to the way you parse sentences. Okay? So I think I should stop here. I shouldn't take all your time. Maybe we can discuss some more if you have any questions. And I'd like to thank you. Thank you for this invitation. And I'd like to wish you good luck with your research. And you should remember, this field is a field where anything goes. There is no authorities. You can ask the simplest possible question, and it can be very rewarding because it can uncover a very large number of possibilities. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Yanis, for this very inspiring talk, and I'm sure there will be some questions.
Can is a question from a lady with roots in Cyprus.
Cultural roots, yeah. Thank you for a fascinating talk, but I'd like you just to elaborate on your statement that there's no action without contact.
Yeah.
Because would your system cope with an imaginary action of cutting?
Imagine.
Like there is no physical object, but you're doing the actions. So
You can imagine the action, yes.
So could your system cope with that?
No, no. What we have been working on is the here and now. Now he's holding it, now he's cutting. So we haven't, now your question is much closer to the simulation question we were discussing yesterday with Srini and the others. The simulation, because you have to think about it, right? I didn't understand you.
Form, drawing a line on the table or cutting the eggplant, I would still be performing the action. What would be missing is the real object.
The real,
I would
and
still
real
be
contact. Yes.
I would still perform the action. So could your system complete an analysis and an interpretation on that?
Oh, you mean like you pretend that you cut something which is not there? No, we can't deal with that yet. We can't because, you know, it has to be an object there. We would have to hallucinate the object, so to speak. And we can't do that yet.
But you could still analyze the action.
But you could, yes, yes, exactly.
I was surprised that you tell us a story about how attention is then important to direct it to an object. But it seemed like the perception was really decoupled from analyzing the action that you have. Everything segmented beforehand. I would have expected you to say, well, then once I have grasped something, now I'm looking for, or I recognize the grasp, and now I'm looking only for objects that this could act on, or once I have the hand, I look for graspable objects. So is that just an approximation, or you think the order perception and then you're parsing and so on?
No, I didn't talk about this. Because you didn't give me more time, Gregor. At the beginning, he said 2 hours, then he went down to 1, then it became 1.5. Okay. Yes, so you are bringing, what he is bringing in is dynamic aspects of attention, okay, which I didn't show here. But for example, when the guy picks up the knife or the saw and he's going towards a location, we already know where he's going. How do we know that? We know that from the results of that famous French guy that died a few years ago, Jean Rau. Jean Rau is his name. I'm looking for a chalk. You have a chalk? Anyway, what Jean Rau did, he studied what happens to... Oh, okay, thank you. Thank you. So basically, if you go with your hand to grasp something and you measure the velocity, you're going to get something like this as a profile. And the thing is that this peak, the peak velocity, is proportional to the distance that you have to the object. So as you go, so basically you can predict where it's going, and you can look there, and you can do the processing. It's going on, okay? I didn't talk about that. Also, the other aspect of attention, which is based on prior knowledge, okay, that is, you have a tool, and you move in this tool. What can this tool do? What can this tool do? And what are the objects that I have in there that could be recipient to the tool for, oh, it's a tomato, it's a cucumber, and it's a piece of cheese, and it is a ball. So it could go to the tomato, it could go to the piece of cheese, it could go to the, because these objects go with these actions. So In order to do this, you need a resource. The lexicon is not enough. You have to rearrange the lexicon to make new connections. So when you have a tool, you can know this tool goes with which actions. And this tool goes with which objects. And those become predictions for the attention mechanism to go in there. Of course, they are informed by the torque mechanism, because the torque mechanism is taken very seriously about the existence of an object there. So if the torque mechanism says, no, no, there is no object here, and then you're not going to go there. So you may miss it if the torque makes a mistake.
My turn? Okay. I have a technical question for the vision.
Yes, sir.
For the torque. I mean, how do you handle the sign of the torque?
The sign.
Yes.
So basically,
because
yeah. So basically, you have two kinds of edges. For the ones that are not familiar with visual processing, you have edges that go from black to white or from white to black. So you call the first kind positive, the second kind negative. So you're going to have a positive torque for one class, a negative torque for the other class. You take the algebraic sum.
Okay, but in the example with the statues, the negative max or the minima would be just as good for segmentation as the maxima, or is that?
Yes, yes, it can happen, where you have the space between two objects. Okay, but this is this is the starting point.
Okay.
The starting point. Now, if you have information about depth values, you can very quickly disambiguate. Otherwise, you can't if you don't have any prior information. The space between two objects may be considered as another object. And anybody who has worked with robots and objects on a table must have come across this if you only work with visual sensors. Because you may think, you know, that the space in between here is an object if you don't have depth information. Good point.
Okay. You mentioned the 4 problems of action control in your field. And I want to just to introduce a notion from developmental psychology that's called the canonical use of objects, which is the problem that babies also face or have to solve when learning to use objects. Steering is not something that there is not just one way to do that, which is to do in a way that doesn't spoil the cup or the use of a spoon. There is a way
Talk about the example with the robot.
Exactly. So it's just a suggestion if you might find this potentially fruitful to apply, because the way babies solve this problem, to recognize that there is a canonical use is by social learning, clearly. Babies are taught not to grasp the spoon in some way, but to do it in some other way, or they are corrected, or I don't know if that might be relevant in this context. But the other question is one skeptical. I would like to raise a skeptical doubt whether this notion of action grammar, these trees, are really required. So what's in the trees or in the links beyond a sequence? Is there in a way you can explain that there's some
sequence? Okay, you have the relationship. You have this recursive relationship because, you know, hand merges with a tool merges with object, so you have this depth in the tree that is denoting the kind of action that is taking place. There is not just seriality. Those trees can go very deep, very large in depth, not just going like that, depending, of course, on the complexity of the underlying action.
But it's not a way to to formulate the movements that are being done one after the other.
The movements,
By
but
the-
they
by
are
each
in
hand.
symbolic, but they are in symbolic form, okay? And those movements can be related to each other, because you could, in principle, be doing something with the left hand, something else with the right hand, and those movements could be interacting. So, what your colleague here is bringing forward is he's asking about the complexity, in some sense, of this framework, okay? Because here we have a simple context-free grammar, and it is modeling a large number of actions, all right? Now, think of a bird that is feeding its chick, where you pick up something with your mouth and you put it in another mouth. I would bet this is a regular grammar, simple. But now think of an action that me and Gregor are going to do together, involving various things, and with context playing an important role. Then don't expect a context-free grammar to model this. It's got to be a context-sensitive grammar of some sort. So, what I would like to suggest is that within the confines of what I have been presenting here, there is some formalism that is lurking that has to do with complexity of action in the whole animal kingdom, so to speak. And I do not know if the Chomsky hierarchy is the right one to sort of show the different complexities, but it's a beginning, because we do not know. In computer science, we have that hierarchy, and then we have other hierarchies that are inside that one. But this is, in some sense, some guiding principle. Yeah.
Thank you. Actually, my question also goes in the action grammar direction. Two questions kind of to it. On the one hand side, I wonder if you have thought about how it generalizes to other domains, right? I mean, if it's an action grammar and it's related to Chomsky, you would expect that it can actually generalize to things where the action and the object are not as clear anymore, right? So that's my one question. And the other question is...
Yeah, one by one, man. I'll forget, okay? So the first question you say, how you generalize to what?
To other domains.
Other
not
domain means
objects.
something you do not with your hands.
You do with your
your
other
mouth.
people, you do with in a society and in other...
No, wait a minute. You are talking about actions that we do, right? So if you don't do the action with your hands, with what you're going to do the action? Maybe with your legs? I mean, you have to have a body part. The body part has to be involved.
Well, the original action grammar, yes, right? But can it generalize to other domains where the action is not anymore a clear interaction with an object, but an interaction with another person, for example?
So you mean,
It's like, let's
instead
walk
of cutting
together,
a tomato,
or
I
let's
kill Gregor. I kill Gregor with a knife, where he is the object of my action. I'm just trying to understand you whether you talk about metaphorical actions.
Yeah, kind of metaphorical
where you are a
actions.
preacher and you
basically, right?
preach to your congregation. And,
Like the talk
and-
we had yesterday about it. Do you think it's related, basically?
yeah, I haven't thought about metaphorical actions, so to speak, to be honest with you. Interaction with other people, then you can treat the one person as the recipient of the action, or if he's not a recipient, maybe he's a co-agent. Together you are doing something, or you are doing something together and you are affecting him at the same time. So that gets complicated, because an agent can be the object of another agent and can be his own agent in doing something. So, yes, these are really interesting questions.
The other one I was going to say, so right now you're using the grammar mainly for parsing, basically.
Mainly for parsing,
right?
yes.
But in the end, right, our communication system is for conveying ideas and probably first of all conveying a goal, like an intention or something, right? So can you convey goals with this grammar? And can you do, maybe additionally, can you do planning with it? Reinforcement learning inside the
exactly.
grammar?
That's, I mean, if I was more of a planning guy, I could have given this whole thing a planning flavor, because those trees, they're basically showing plans of what is going on, okay? So, now the other thing about the goals of the action, I mean, if I wanted to be purposive, that's how I would present it. I would say, what I want is this. This is my goal. I want to change this object in that kind of way. What do I have to do? Okay, zoom comes the tree or the set of trees. Zoom comes the grammar and says, well, first you have to do this, then you have to do that, and then you are finished. Okay, so to answer your question, yes, you can formulate this in a purposive sense, where you are driven by a goal. You say, my goal is to do that, okay? And then you go backwards, you get your trees, and you formulate your plan. My friend, I met this man a few years ago when I was here in Thessaloniki, and I hear that he's finishing his PhD. Very pleasing.
Well, concerning the presentation, the videos that you have shown us just in your presentation, in one of the videos, the right hand was moving alone, and in another video, the left hand was moving, doing an action alone, and in another video, both of them were doing the same action. So while you were trying to build an action, to translate the action into sentences from bottom level to the upper level, you were tracking first the hands and reaching to the target, the main target. I imagine that you have a kind of knowledge basis, which means that you are recognizing a knife, then you go and see that the action associated to the knife is cutting something. What about if I have my two hands are involved in two actions, and the actions are different actions? What kind of pragmatic verification you are doing progressively?
Man. You are making it so hard. It's like, you know, you are doing something here, you are doing something there, you know, and maybe you are doing something here.
Not in that way, but sometimes...
No, I understand you, yeah, right. My hope is that this generalizes to that, but I have not thought or done an experiment to that effect. I wanted to make sure that the one hand or two simple things work out. But certainly this is a very interesting direction to go on, because human actions have this very interesting attribute. You can walk and chew gum at the same time, as the Americans say. Okay, you can do many things at the same time. And if you have an interpretation of action system, it should be able to handle all of them. Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting talk. You were focusing, well, you were pointing to the interesting parallels between the language faculty and the motor knowledge in terms of trees. And actually my question is related to Tony's comment. Whether, okay, this is definitely a very interesting level of description of the two domains. The question is whether this is really necessary, whether it's not more plausible to think about the knowledge in terms of sequential patterns. The recent evidence in language understanding from psychological science paper suggests that human may not really be sensitive to the hierarchical structure of sentences, but rather to sequential, like Markov chain view of sentence processing seems more likely. So in a similar way, related to the motor domain, whether the motor knowledge could indeed be a repertoire of motor sequential patterns that we can, on a context-dependent way, draw from, rather than parse tree during sentence, during action execution. So do you really think that that tree representation is something that our brain is doing, or is it merely a useful level of representation that's understandable?
Well, you know, this is a difficult question. It's like, do humans use trees in their brains when they analyze sentences? Do we use derivatives when we do some optimization to find an object? It's hard to answer to you, you know. For example, if you have, if you make those grammars probabilistic, which is the right thing to do, you know, to capture the uncertainty better, then when you have probabilistic grammars, probabilistic context-free grammars, you can show that they are equivalent to some graphical model, some hidden Markov model of some sort. So there is a relationship between like hidden Markov models and you know, context-free grammars. There are relationships. But I mean, the ultimate solution, the understanding, what happens with the understanding of a particular situation by a human, is obviously highly opportunistic and very purposive. So you may or may not use some of those structures. It's not clear. However, for the particular system that we have been designing, the fact that I have the trees allows me to make sentences. If I didn't have the trees, I would have it a little harder to make sentences. Okay? So, since I would like to produce language as the ultimate outcome of this, so that I turn the videos into, you know, a linguistic description, I'm going with the trees. If I had a different problem to solve, I might have, you know, ventured into developing a graphical model of some sort. Okay? But I'll tell you what the problem is, and I'm glad I had this opportunity, and it is related to the question of the guy from Mallorca. So, I don't remember his name, but I remember that he is from Mallorca.
Tony Gomila.
Huh? Tony Gomila. Yeah, he had a good point. So, in computer science, when you're asked to do some modeling task, what you usually do is maximal models. Maximal. What does maximal mean? It means you want to capture everything that is there. The whole thing. Everything that you have in your input and relationships to other things, you want to put them together. And you can have a Markov random field, or you can have, you know, a very powerful, or a CRF that are in fashion nowadays, that will capture everything. Okay. However, if you are in terra incognita, if you have no clue of what is going on, this is the biggest lesson I learned from Chomsky. When you are in that situation, you are better off with minimalist models. The smallest possible model that can describe your situation. Then you can build up from there. Okay? Because the problem with these maximal models and the existence of priors and data for learning, you know, all of this is that you can do good predictions, but you don't understand much about what is going on. It's like Chomsky says, what is the best, let's say you want to find the weather outside your window today. If you take all the data for the past 100 years and you make these maximal models, you'll be able to predict pretty accurately what is the weather going to be outside your window. Yes, but you are not going to know anything about the weather. You're not going to know about pressure and about this and this variable, and when the pressure is changing, the temperature is going up, and all of these things creates wind, and you wouldn't know any of that stuff. Okay, so we are tempted to use maximal models and a lot of data, but we fall into this trap. So my own personal taste on the matter is go for minimal models so that you can understand what is happening. After you have that, you can keep expanding in order to make your understanding deeper.
You maybe suggested this, or I just saw this in what you were saying. Are you considering the possibility that the grammar of action is an universal grammar which in some sense comes before the universal grammar a la Chomsky? And that this could be rooted into the embodiment. So, I mean, the universal grammar Chomsky's or something like that, universal grammar could be in some sense universal because it is a consequence of the fact that the agent is embodied. So this is very speculative. I agree.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. Yeah. Because whether you're Chinese or Greek, when you see somebody cutting a tomato, you understand this. Now, if you ask to say what is happening, you're going to say different things. But your understanding of the event is independent of the language that you speak. And it is subject, maybe, to a mechanism like the one I described. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank Yanis again.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.